We're going to begin with Matthew Dale Harris, who's going to talk to us on the infrastructure levy and what we can expect from it. Some of us may be feeling a little bit of a sense of deja vu when we read the legislation here, because of this just being the latest in a series of attempts to simplify the way in which contributions from development to local infrastructure is provided. And obviously we'll have to wait and see what the regs say in detail. But Matthew will introduce us to the legislative scheme. We're then going to hear from Stephen Morgan, who's going to talk about post-decision issues, amendments, appeals and enforcement, obviously highly topical. We'll hear from Stephen as to what the implications are for cases like Finney, and also how this might play out in the light of the Snowdonia and Hillside case on slot-in permissions. Nick's then going to talk on compulsory purchase, compensation and development corporations. And I think Nick will agree with me that there's not a huge amount to say on the compulsory purchase and compensation side. Lots of local authorities have been asking for easier powers to exercise to get housing sites going, but there's no sign of that in this legislation, and we'll hear from Nick as to what it does and doesn't do. Matthew is a specialist in planning and environmental law. He's on the C panel of government barristers, and he's also highly rated in the planning magazine of top planning juniors under 35. And he works for both sides in development issues. And by way of example, he's helping Enfield with their local plan at the moment. And so ideally positioned to talk to us about the implications of the infrastructure levy proposals. Stephen has had a very long career in planning. After graduating with a Masters in Environmental Planning, he now acts on all sides of development control issues across the nation, including at the moment promoting a garden settlement in Kent. And Nick joined Chambers in 2019 and has a wide-ranging planning and environmental practice, including significant CPO cases where I understand he's just won a bit of a significant victory for one of his clients on a CPO compensation deal. So if I can move on and ask Matthew, please, to tell us a bit about the infrastructure levy. Matthew.
Good morning, everybody. So yes, I'm going to be talking us through the proposals for an infrastructure levy, infrastructure delivery strategies, and how that's going to sit with the existing infrastructure provision powers under Section 106 of the 1990 Act and SIL. These proposals were one of the things that was actually in the white paper, and one of relatively few, I think, survivors in toto from that original setting out of the government's intentions. We're in a situation where there's a lot of detail that needs to come in through regulations, but the infrastructure or the structure and the framework that is used is Schedule 11 of the Act will insert a new Part 10A into the 2008 Planning Act. And we also have a policy paper which gives significant further information on the government's policy intentions for the infrastructure levy, and I've given you the link there. My approach on this talk, and I think we need to bear in mind that the infrastructure levy will in due course merit whole webinar series, probably in due course, is going to be to talk you through the headline points on the kind of policy fronting and what we can see of the government's intentions, and then give you an overview of the statutory framework as it now stands in draft in the schedule. So headline points. Firstly, the intention is for SIL and Section 106 to be generally, not always, but generally replaced for provision of infrastructure funding by the infrastructure levy, IL, as the statute has it, which is going to be charged in distinction to SIL as a fixed proportion of gross development value above a set threshold. One of the questions that was put out through the consultation, through the white paper consultation, was whether or not those rates should be established nationally, either as a single rate or set according to different, set to have different areas of application, or locally. And government has bowed to quite a lot of consultation responses that asked for local setting. So we're going to have a situation that's probably quite familiar from the SIL process, and setting of rates locally via charging schedules. Local authorities, who will be the charging authorities in most instances, will also be required to produce infrastructure delivery strategies, which we'll come to in a bit more detail later. The levy is to be charged on the value of property when it's sold, reflecting the GDV target. And the goal, the government says, is to secure at least as much affordable housing, specifically, as developer contributions currently do. There is a mechanism which we'll look at, which suggests how the government thinks it's going to do that. Section 106, we know from the policy paper, is to be retained for narrowly targeted site-specific infrastructure. Examples given being things like open space, on-site open space, and for the delivery of the larger sites where infrastructure is to be provided in kind. But as we'll see, where exactly Section 106 is going to have a role to play and is to be left to be defined by the regulations in due course. So the infrastructure, or the architecture of the bill, it will introduce Section 204A, which will confer on the Secretary of State a power, along with the Treasury, to make regulations providing for the imposition of the infrastructure levy in England. The Secretary of State will be required to ensure that the infrastructure levy has a purpose and meets a purpose, which is to ensure that costs incurred in supporting the development of an area and in achieving any purpose specified under Section 204(9) N5, that's a specific provision which I don't need to worry about for now, where other purposes can be added, can be funded wholly or partly by owners or developers of land in a way that does not make development of the area economically unviable. So that balance, which perhaps is unsurprising, between trying to spread the costs of delivering development and trying to ensure that those are met by developers and owners, but without making the development of the area unviable. Key provisions I'm just picked out here. Section 204B defines local or planning authorities as the charging authorities and provides that they must charge infrastructure levy in respect to development. And we'll see later there is likewise an obligation on charging authorities to adopt, to produce and adopt charging schedules. So unlike SIL, local authorities are going to have to put this in place. Section 204, liability, that will arise on commencement of the development, or where there's been a change in ownership, when a person assumes liability in accordance with the regulations after commencement. The amount of the liability will be calculated by reference to the charging schedule, which has effect at the time when planning permission first permits the development, as a result of which the levy becomes payable. So it's going to be prospective in that sense. It's not going to affect existing planning permissions. The detail of that definition is one of the things which Section 204E requires the regulations to define. So the regulations will have to set out provision to determine, in the case of situations like permission by development order or outline permission, when exactly it is that planning permission is deemed to first permit a development. But so we'll have to wait to see from the regulations when exactly that bites, but we will get a definition of that in due course. 204E also defines terms like development and planning question, etc. So we'll have to look carefully at that in due course. Absolutely central provision is section 204G. That imposes the obligation on charging authorities to issue charging schedules, which will set rates or other criteria by which the amount of infrastructure levy chargeable is to be determined. There are two subsections within 204G which contain mandatory considerations that the local authorities, the charging authorities, are going to have regard to. And the first of that is the provision which essentially provides the hook for the government's intention that the infrastructure levy will produce at least as much funding for affordable housing as is currently delivered. And that requires the charging authority to have regard to the desirability of ensuring that the level of affordable housing funded by developers and the level of funding is maintained at a level which, over a specified period to be specified in the regulations, is equal to or exceeds the level of such housing and funding provided over an earlier specified period of the same length. So a sort of we're going to keep the level at, says the government, we're going to keep the level of housing and funding at least that which has previously existed. Obviously, the period and method for working all this out is going to be critical, but we'll have to wait for that. Second mandatory set of considerations is going to be on the side of economic viability, but also the broader strategic questions and broader strategic features of the local authority area. So not just the economic viability of the particular rates that are being proposed, but also the interaction of that with things that may affect the value of land in the local authority area, development plan, or most obviously extant planning permissions, or the provision of infrastructure, so new road proposals, transport proposals. Also, we'll have to consider previous levels of provision and the charging authority's infrastructure delivery strategy. The detail of how exactly the chargeable amount is to be calculated on the basis of how that will interact with the charging schedules is again left to the regulations. But notable, if you look at subsections 7 and 8, is that they're very broad and contain a number of notable features, such as an option to deal with, to take account of valuations or other documents that have been prepared in relation to other statutory purposes. So potentially there may be some provision to take account of valuations prepared by the valuation officer, for example. But we'll have to see what that's fleshed out as. A quick overview, bearing in mind the time, of the other provisions. And we've got provisions there for the preparation, examination, and adoption of charging schedules. There's a definition of the infrastructure to which the receiving authorities must apply infrastructure levy. That goes broader than just affordable housing. It is a broad. It includes transport infrastructure. It includes a wide range of things. But of course, it's going to have to be tied to the infrastructure which the local authority anticipates coming forwards through the delivery strategy in the relevant period. There's the provisions for passing on receipts to other authorities or persons who are providing infrastructure, so classically to education or healthcare. There are provisions for collection, enforcement, and appeals. And there's also a couple of provisions which give overarching powers to the Secretary of State to issue guidance, direct exemptions, or review of charging schedules. The infrastructure delivery strategy that's addressed in section 204Q. Another requirement, regulations are to set out the detail of what's to be required, but they must set out the strategic plans, however expressed of the charging authority in relation to the application of infrastructure levies. So they're going to need to set out at a strategic level what the charging authority anticipates infrastructure levy is going to be spent on. They will also require examination with the detail to be set out. And I think it's fair to say that the policy paper indicates that the regulations are likely to enable local authorities to bring in other providers and bodies to require them to come forward and help them with the devising of their strategies and their development plans. One big hanging question is, of course, the retained role which Section 106 will have. I've already mentioned the provisions that are, or the references to this that are given in the policy paper. I thought I'd also give you some of the detail. I'll give you the reference to Section 204Z1. Regulations may make provision for the interrelation with SIL and Section 106, but there isn't any detail. The policy paper says specifically that in relation to the regulations, 106 may be used to require developers to deliver infrastructure integral to the operation and physical design of the site, so internal play area or flood risk mitigation. But this is the focus I refer to, the need to make that narrowly targeted. What that means, we'll have to see. And also, the regulations are going to need to detail the retained role for Section 106 agreements to support delivery of the larger sites where infrastructure is to be provided in kind and negotiated. There's a reference to that needing to guarantee that the value of what's negotiated there will be no less than what's paid through the levy. Be interesting to see how, for these very large sites, that interacts with the process of preparing charging schedules and infrastructure delivery plans, but that at least is the policy intention at this point. So those, I think, are the key provisions. I've had a couple of questions which I can address at the end, but for now I'll leave that and hand over to Stephen.
Thank you, Matthew. Hope I can be heard.
Yes, Stephen, we can hear you fine.
Thank you very much. Just there we are. Yes, as I say, thank you, Matthew. Just echo David's welcome to you all. It's good to see so many have joined. And I'm going to deal, as David has already said, with post-decision matters. Really three areas these cover. They are minor variations in planning permission, important change, the increase in enforcement powers over a range of matters, and finally enforcement appeals and certain restrictions in relation to those. Some of these changes, you'll take your own view and you'll follow it through, but some of these changes seem a little cosmetic perhaps in practice, but some are pretty crucial and fairly fundamental, which I'll seek to illustrate. And the other thing I should just mention in relation to the bill itself, the explanatory notes, certainly in respect to some of the matters, merit consideration, and I will just refer to those as we go as necessary. With regard to those notes, where one is considering the proposals to allow for specifically minor variations to planning permissions, it is worth starting with the note, which says that the existing framework for varying planning permissions is often seen as confusing, burdensome and overly restrictive by applicants and local planning authorities, and recent case law has compounded these issues. That may echo true with many of you. And that current position, briefly, of course, is we have Section 73 applications available to develop land without compliance with conditions and non-material changes to planning permissions under Section 96A. But that leaves certain holes, as was illustrated by the Finney case, which David said I'd be referring to. And that was, of course, where there was a planning permission for wind turbines, and the developer wanted to change the height of those wind turbines, the blades, to 125 metres when 100 metres was in the description, and it was held that it fell outside the scope of that provision, hence a hole in the provisions to make changes to planning permissions. And there's also the complication, of course, arising from the Hillside Parks case, which is coming before the Supreme Court in July, I believe. But that sort of indicated some very far-reaching potential issues with having to look at a holistic, a permission holistically, and whether you could actually drop in applications. So in that context, we have clause 98 introducing a new section 73B, application for permission substantially the same as the existing permission. And any such application has to be based on an existing permission, and that's other than one which has been granted under section 73, 73A or 73B, so it's section 73 in any of its manifestations. And that existing permission must have been granted on application. Query whether that would allow for a prior approval permission to be subject of such an application. The application itself can propose conditions, if any, to which it should be subject, but something you'll be familiar with, it can't change the date for the development to be started or for reserved matters applications to be made. They can't change that. And just also note this power will apply to a permission in principle as well. And just get to the heart of it though, because it's critical to note what the power actually is. And you can only grant this new permission if the following criteria is met. Its effect, and that's by reference to both the development it authorises and any conditions to which it is subject, will not be substantially different from that of the existing permission. So will not be substantially different from. That's obviously a matter of planning judgment, and it appears it will be given a broad approach. But the determination is based, again, this may not be a surprise, that's based on limiting considerations to those respects in which the permission being applied for would differ in effect from the existing permission identified under any other permission, for example, one granted under section 73 arising from the original grant. In terms of the practice of this, it does seem broad, and hopefully it will address, certainly address the FINI constriction, that's the aim, but hopefully also, because it's an express power, address the concerns that could potentially arise from the Hillside case. But to note, there's no right of appeal if permission is refused, and none I could see and referred to or anticipated, so it'd have to be a judicial review. You get a new planning permission, but it's to be noted you can't avoid the mandatory, for example, biodiversity requirement that's going to be imposed under Schedule 7A of the Town and Country Planning Act. So I hope it gives you a snapshot of that important new power. How it works out in practice, we'll see. Can I turn now then to enforcement and the enhanced powers that the bill proposes to introduce? Put these into two because I'm taking a broad definition of enforcement. Firstly, enforcing the carrying out of the development authorised. There's going to be a new development commencement notice power, or requirement, I should say, and they're also extending the powers of completion notices. There's also a second limb to this, is there's an extension of the powers in relation to unauthorised development, ranging from the time limits for taking enforcement action to increase in some penalties. And let's just dip into that, if we may. Firstly then, development commencement notice, that's a new requirement. And it requires the person carrying out development to serve the notice before development is begun. That's where there's a planning application or a section 73 application being made. And it has to contain the information to be prescribed. Not clear precisely what that is, but there's an example in the explanatory notes for a residential scheme, and that refers to the delivery rate proposed or likely, phasing, an expected completion date, just to give you a flavour. And this is to give more information. I think the aim of this is to give more information to both the local authority and to local people as to what's going on sites and what's to be expected. That information is to be included in the planning register, which echoes that point about publicity for it and knowledge of it. And if there's a failure to comply with it, and there's a requirement for authorities when granting permission to let developers know that they have to do this, but there's a power to serve a notice to provide the information, and there's a fine, consequential fine, if it's not complied with. So that's the new development commencement notice power. There's also completion notices are already in existence, but little used in my experience. Others may have a different knowledge of this, but little used because they don't actually get any completion of the development. And that seems to be still be the position. I mean, the main change, there's two main changes here, because a notice, completion notice, can be served after the deadline for commencement of development has passed. And in this, currently under the provisions of the Town and Country Planning Act, the time limits under sections 91 and 92 have to have lapsed. But it also currently requires confirmation by the Secretary of State. And the proposed new power will take away the requirement for that confirmation. It would also, importantly, not require, as I read the provisions, the lapsing of those time limits, which is interesting. Should just be noticed the provisions apply retrospectively to permissions granted before the measures came into effect. But where you've got a completion notice served before the new measures come into effect, that's subject to the current procedures. That's what's proposed. The important, as I say, this new section 93H, as it will be called, gives a power to serve that notice which for development which has commenced as required, but those time limits do not have to have lapsed. But in the authority's opinion, the development will not be completed in a reasonable period. And that period must be at least, as now indeed, 12 months after the service of the completion notice. And as now, the effect of the notice is that planning permission to which it relates becomes invalid at these deadline imposed by the notice, whether as originally specified or substituted on appeal. And section 93I introduces a process of appeal. So although you don't have to get it confirmed by the Secretary of State, there's not really sure where this takes one, because you still subject to an appeal. The other thing that's not changed, as I've already indicated, is development carried out under the Planning Commission up to the time prior to the commencement completion notice taking effect is not affected. So again, there's no power to get development actually completed. And of course, the notice is of no effect pending the final determination of an appeal or withdrawal. So I just wonder, how effectively these new provisions will actually pan out to be in practice in achieving what people are seeing as problems with completion notices, that they don't perhaps go far enough in the minds of some. So can I switch from that then to enforcement relating to unauthorised development, and just give you a flavour of the changes here. Small slide, very big and important point. Effectively, all immunity periods are going to be 10 years if this new power takes effect and when it takes effect. So the 4-year time limit for unauthorised operational development, and fairly fundamentally for change of use of any building to use as a single dwelling house, will become 10 years. That's in England. In Wales, there remains to be 10 years period for that. So as I say, you get the common 10-year period, and that will have some fundamental changes. It's to give local authorities obviously more chance to investigate situations and have situations for breach of planning control in those respects brought to their attention so they can take action. Another extension of the powers is the duration of temporary stop notices. That's to be increased from 28 days to 56 days. That also will relate into temporary stop notice for unauthorised works for listed buildings. Again, extending it up to 56 days. And there are other powers relating to listed buildings, but we're not going to focus on those today. Also, enforcement warning notices. I'm not sure this is much different to what happens now, but effectively it formalises. There's a new power inserted where you indicate to someone where there has been unauthorised development that there's a reasonable prospect of it being acceptable, and you formally invite them to submit a retrospective planning application. And again, if such an application is not received as now, if you give such a warning letter, then the local planning authority can take enforcement action. There's also relief from enforcement of planning conditions. That's to be formalised. You will remember, no doubt, during COVID, for example, when local authorities were encouraged, and there was the Business and Planning Act as well, and ministerial statements, to be flexible about, for example, delivery hours. And the specific example given in the notes is in relation to the shortage of heavy goods vehicle drivers, leading to the need for deliveries outside of usual hours. And this allows the Secretary of State to provide by regulations specific directions not to take enforcement action on such restrictions. So bringing in flexibility. There's also, in terms of the enhanced powers, the increase in penalties in relation to enforcement of for breach of planning conditions and for section 215 notices relating to the maintenance of land where that's affecting the amenity of the area. And I set out there what those increases are. I don't need to read them out, just to make you aware of those. And finally on this, that there are going to be more restrictions on Ground A appeals for enforcement notices. That's where the planning permission should be granted, and it's going to extend circumstances where Ground A is prohibited to cover the situation where a related application has been submitted even before the determination has expired. This is currently the position, and that's where the enforcement notice is served within 2 years of the date of the related application. So restriction on a Ground A appeal coming in terms of enforcement notices, and also the power that exists already for the Secretary of State where he or she considers there's been undue delay caused by the appellant. The power that already exists under section 79 subsection 6A is to be extended in relation to enforcement notice appeals and lawful development certificate appeals, allowing the Secretary of State to issue a notice requiring steps to be taken within a specified time, and if you don't, the appeal is dismissed. And finally, just harking back to Matthew's interesting and useful talk, insofar as planning obligations will remain and have the function, then I noticed that in clause 110, it is there's a new power proposed allowing for regulations to be made in connection with the discharge and modification of an obligation and the circumstances in which that can take place. There's no guidance in the note in the enforcement explanatory note, sorry, in that section. There's no guidance as to how this is to be used, whether it's relating to existing or future obligations, but I just thought I'd point that out in case it's relevant to anyone. So thank you very much for listening. I will now pass you on to Nick Grant, who is going to be dealing with regeneration.
Thank you, Stephen. Morning, everyone, and again, thanks for joining. I'm going to speak about two distinct aspects of the bill, development corporations, which is part 6, and then changes, as Dave has already indicated, to compulsory purchase, which is in part 7. So starting with development corporations, it's worth, because a lot of what the changes do is build on what's already there, worth being aware of where things currently are pre-LERB. So there are 4 types of development corporation. I can't go through all of them in detail, but by way of overview, there's the Urban Development Corporation, provided for by the 1980 Act. These are created by the Secretary of State. They're given various powers to acquire property, submit plans for redevelopment, for example, but they can submit those plans to the Secretary of State by passing the planning process. They may exercise LPA functions at the moment, but only in relation to development control and not plan making. There's currently, I think, only one in existence, and that's in Ebbsfleet. Mayoral development corporations are different. They're created by mayors, unsurprisingly, not just the Mayor of London. They're given powers again to acquire, redevelop land. They can take on the role of an LPA, but crucially for both plan making and development management. They may also make CPOs and, as one would expect, the ancillary private powers like carrying on business. There are 4 currently in existence: QE Olympic Park, Old Oak and Park Royal, Stockport Town Centre West and South Tees. The third is the New Towns Act development corporations. Again, the Secretary of State can designate an area for development as a new town and create a development corporation to secure the laying out and development of the town. They can acquire, manage, dispose of property. They can't become the LPA for the area, but they may submit development plans straight to the Secretary of State, who can grant permission via a special development order. They may also, again, apply for CPOs, but that's obviously got to be approved by the Secretary of State. The fourth element, or the fourth currently existing model, is new towns, but with oversight. So changes to government regulations in 2018 allow local planning authorities to become the oversight authorities for the New Towns Act development corporations. Now, they can take on a number of roles allotted to the Secretary of State by the 1981 Act, including, for example, consenting to development corporations paying for matters such as acquiring land, directing the New Towns Act corporations to act, consenting to those special development orders, so taking that function from the Secretary of State, and consenting to CPOs. The SOS must appoint that oversight authority, and they haven't, to the best of my knowledge, been used so far. So the government consulted in 2018 on making changes to the development corporations. The government's received the response, but they hasn't actually published its own response to this until we get to the bill. Now, the proposal is to make provision for a new type of locally led urban development corporation with the objective of regenerating its area and being accountable to local authorities in the area rather than the Secretary of State. So this is going to introduce changes both to the New Towns Act for the New Towns Development Corporations and the 1980 Act for Urban Development Corporations. So rather than go through each in turn, I'm going to synthesize them. But basically, in broad form, what the change will allow is local authorities or a group of local authorities to propose to the Secretary of State that a new locally led development corporation or new town be set up, and for one of those LPAs to act as the oversight authority. Now, this proposal must come from the local authorities in which the area lies. They can't start triggering it for other LPAs. But area for this purpose can consist of separate non-contiguous areas. So you could have a bit here and a bit here and a bit here, and they don't need to be joined up. Any proposal, however, can only be made after statutory consultation is undertaken. And there is a statutory list of consultees, local people, local businesses, local authorities for the areas covered, unsurprisingly, in London, the GLA, and relatively unusually, local MPs are now statutory consultees. The Secretary of State, once he's received the proposal, then decides effectively if the land can be designated in the test I've set out on your slides, whether it would be expedient in the local interest for that designation to take place. Now, if he does do that, he must designate the number of members in the corporation that's being set up and which authority is to be the oversight authority. So 4 oversight authorities focus on the changes to the UDC Act, for Urban Development Corporations, sorry. Now, these are established by the Secretary of State for regulations, Secretary of State by regulations, sorry. And those regs may specify how the oversight authority is to oversee the regeneration. Now, there's a lot of flexibility given to the Secretary of State in the actual current clause of the bill, so it's difficult to be prescriptive, but basically he can say that the oversight authority is to exercise any of the specific functions under Part 16 of the 1980 Act, or all of them, or that the oversight authority may only exercise those functions subject to, for example, specified conditions or limitations. So the Secretary of State has a broad power here, but it is possible for oversight authorities, for the LPA that becomes an oversight authority, to effectively take on the role of what the Secretary of State currently does. Much of that is already in. The reason I focused on the urban development corporations is because much of that is already in the New Towns Act because of, as I've said, Part 4, the fourth type of development corporation there, which already exists, which is New Towns Act with oversight authorities. In terms of planning powers, there is a general move to make the planning powers more uniform across the different types of development corporation. So the mayoral DCs, as I've said, are currently able to be the LPAs for an area, both for plan making and development control, and both urban development corporations and new or locally led UDCs and new town DCs are to be given that power by the Secretary of State by order. However, they don't have to, or they can make arrangements, even if they're granted that power by the Secretary of State, for the discharge of planning functions to be undertaken by the LPA that would have had the function but for the order. So basically, the Secretary of State can designate them, and then they can say, great, we want the other LPA to do it. I anticipate you'll probably, if this stays in its unamended form, I anticipate you'll see this certainly in the early stages of development. These development corporations, while they're finding their feet, there can be a real benefit in LPAs that have a wealth of experience already taking on that role, at least in the immediate term. And in fact, some of us are seeing that, not with UDCs, but with other new authorities that have been established. I'm seeing that already. Mayoral development corporations are also given a new power. They can become the Minerals and Wastes Authority, which they can't currently do. In terms of membership and borrowing, the bill frees up a lot of, or two broad statutory restrictions that are currently in place. So currently there is a cap of 11 members under both the 1980 and 1981 Acts. That's going to be removed. And there's a current cap on borrowing of 100 million for UDCs and 5,250 million for new town DCs. Again, those are both going to be removed, and instead the policy paper suggests that borrowing limits are going to have to be agreed on a case-by-case basis with the Treasury. So that's a very broad overview of the development corporation changes, and moving on to the changes to CPO. Now, as Dave indicated in the start, there are some changes here, but we're not talking a wholesale rewriting of the way CPOs work. The first change, and I'm not taking these necessarily in order of importance, is a tweak to the TCPA 1990. As many of you will be aware, Section 226 is the power there, contains the power by LPAs, which they can use to seek a CPO of an area. And that is going to specify that improvement, which is the power they're currently given, includes regeneration. The reason simply is to give them greater confidence they have the power to acquire land to support regeneration schemes. There's a new change. Clause 141 provides that any of the notices that again, those watching this talk may well be familiar with, that you have to publicise for CPO purposes, now have to be hosted on an appropriate website. And that is defined as one where members of the public could reasonably be expected to find it on searching. And then there are consequential amendments to the minimum period for which those notices have to be up to take into account that change. Inquiries. This is in terms of, not necessarily in terms of the powers of CPO, but in terms of practice, this is a relatively significant change. At the moment, any relevant objector has a right to be heard at an inquiry. For CPOs, that's changing. So now instead, the confirming authority, having regard to the scale and complexity of the CPO, can decide either whether to go to inquiry or to follow the representations procedure. Now, the representations procedure is something to be prescribed by regulations. We don't have those yet, but what is set out in the current clause is that must make provision both for effectively the written reps procedure that we're familiar with in planning, but must include a provision enabling each remaining objector to be heard at a hearing if they so request. So effectively, if you are a relevant objector, your right to be heard is being downgraded from an inquiry to a hearing, basically. Clause 143 is a bigger change to CPOs, and this allows confirming authorities to confirm a CPO conditionally. This is new, so currently CPOs have to be confirmed or not, but they can't be confirmed conditionally. And the clause makes provision that the order as confirmed won't be operative until the confirming authority has decided on an application from the inquiring authority that the conditions have been met. The change also introduced effectively a lapse time, so the order lapses if no confirmation of condition compliance is achieved within a certain time. The procedure for applications showing that discharge again must be prescribed, and we'll have to wait and see what those entail. But again, the statute makes provision, or the clause as it currently is makes provision for relevant objectors. Again, they have to be heard. So those who maintain their objection to the CPO at confirmation stage are going to get another opportunity to fight the conditional, to fight the discharge of conditions stage. And again, there are consequential amendments for notices, etc. Clause 145, or clause 144, sorry, that includes, effectively makes provision, similar provision for what I've just talked about for CPOs made by ministers. Clause 145 amends the date of operation of CPOs to take into account the conditional confirmation. Again, it's basically sort of a knock-on change. Clause 146 is a new power. It allows the confirming authority, when it confirms the order, to include a provision specifying a period longer than 3 years after which the CPO will lapse. So currently, if you get your CPO, it'll lapse after 3 years if not used. The confirming authority is allowed to say, okay, you can have 5, you can have 7. But crucially, that's not something the acquiring authority can ask for. The acquiring authority can't include this in the order it submits for confirmation. It has to come from the confirming authority for whatever reason. Clause 147, again, for those who are familiar with this topic, you'll know that a general vesting declaration vests the land that's the subject of a CPO when it's made. What 147 allows is the acquiring authority and an owner of an interest in land to agree that interest is to vest at some point after the GVD. So even if the GVD is exercised on, say, January, the parties can agree that a particular bit of land in issue won't vest until May, and the consequential points that flow from that, so for example, the right to go in and take possession of the land, obviously won't then kick in until that date of agreed vesting. Clause 148 it's a data provision. The Secretary of State is allowed to make regulations requiring the provision from acquiring authorities of CPO data and set various standards by which those have to be made, by which the data has to be, for example, stored, presented, etc. This is the last part on compensation. There really is, frankly, very little on compensation in the bill. Watch this space. We might see more coming in over the course of the legislative process, but at the moment, these are minor provisions. They don't really change anything. They move around where you find definitions of development and some tweaking to what constitutes the definition of a scheme in the scheme assumptions under Section 6E of the 1981 Act. So again, they're not substantive. Bigger changes may well be on the horizon, but at the moment, not something to particularly worry about. That's it from me. Sorry, it's been a bit brief. Hope it helpful.
Thank you very much, Nick. If I could ask everyone to come back on the screen. We've had a large number of questions. Is everyone coming back on the screen?
Ryan?
Hi. We've had a large number of questions. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to summarise the gist of the questions. I'm going to start, please, with Matthew, if I may. A lot of the questions are about how affordable housing and Section 106 obligations fits in with the new infrastructure levy, including on whether or not you can have on-site requirements for affordable housing, how the prioritisation of affordable housing will work when you've got this pot of money, what comes first? Does the leisure centre come first, or does the affordable housing come first? So over to you, Matthew.
Thank you, David. Yes, so I suppose dealing first with the on-site provision question, there's nothing in the statutory provisions, the draft statutory provisions, which tells us what's going to, how that's going to work. What's said in the policy paper accompanying the bill is there's a proposal to introduce a new right to require on-site provision in lieu of levy payments. Now, that's not given any further explanation or detail and will have to be set out in the regulations. I think one of the interesting questions they'll have to grapple with around that is whether you can see how the regulations could require could allow local charging authorities to require a certain amount of on-site provision as a offset to a particular amount of levy. But in terms of things like tenure or location of the on-site provision, it's hard to see how the regulations themselves could secure provision in the places and in the ways that we could become used to, given the flexibility of Section 106.
Well, whilst you're just on that, Matthew, can I just ask about how this fixed levy idea is going to work, when we all know that some sites can deliver 5% affordable housing, some can deliver 40% affordable housing, and everything in between. I mean, it seems to me that this fixed levy idea is going to cause some issues as to the sites that can afford more not having to provide for more, because they'll just have to pay the average levy across the whole of the area.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's obviously a tension in taking a strategic approach to these kinds of questions. I mean, I think the emphasis behind the provisions as they stand is that that's going to, there isn't going to be so much variation on a site-by-site basis, and certainly the government's policy talk is to kind of remove that element of negotiation. So you would say from that it's inherent that there will be some sites that could provide more, which won't. The question I think will come down to how, well, firstly, whether the government really sticks to its guns in taking 106 out of play, but also how flexible the charging schedules and calculation provisions, amount calculation provisions are, because we don't really know anything about how that's going to sit. It's all to be consulted on through the regulations, and there will be a trade-off, no doubt, between complexity and achieving the goals that the government says it has of maximising developer contributions and certainly making sure that, so it's going to be very difficult, and those of course are absolutely the issues which SIL arguably is founded on.
Yeah, SIL was all on the basis that you get rid of 106, you put it into SIL, and everyone knows where they stand. And that's come back almost full circle back to 106s again.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly where we are. So, I mean, that's like, I suppose, the kind of first point. I mean, I think we had a specific question about first homes as an example of the kind of tenure which, very difficult to deal with, except through some form of registrable obligation on the land, which I suppose you could create something wholly separate that exists only in the regulations, but it'll do pretty much what Section 106 does, I would have thought.
And then finally, I think it's fair to say that the legislation doesn't make it clear whether health contributions towards the NHS central funding can or can't be part of the PACs under the infrastructure spending priorities.
No, so Section 204N has its list of infrastructure, things that constitute infrastructure, and that includes medical facilities, but there's no reference to central funds or maintenance. The draft section also includes a power in the regulations to specify other things that can be added to it. So things can be added to the infrastructure list by regulations, or indeed for there to be some process of, in particular circumstances, authorities can add things. But I think that's unlikely to be used to add in sort of central healthcare funding.
I think I'll have to move on now, I think, but just final brief question. Is it going to simplify matters, do you think?
Seems unlikely to me, but who knows?
Thank you very much. Nick, can I go on to you for a moment? Just a couple of questions to you, really, from the stream, and I'm trying to summarise the questions that have been raised. But how useful are these development corporation changes going to be to local authorities who've got ambitions for big projects, cross-boundary big projects? So they're going to make a significant change?
I think it'll be quite a useful tool. I don't know if they're going to. Yeah, I suppose it gives them a very useful tool that's not already there, and particularly it gives them the ability to go to the Secretary of State and say, look, here's what we want to do, and really drive the process in a way that they might struggle with at the moment, particularly if there are political considerations in play. So I think it's a useful tool, but as with all things like this, it's really in the implementation rather than necessarily the scheme.
And then can I ask about the CPO changes? Some questions have been raised about simplification, whether or not they actually do much to simplify and make it easier for local authorities to do CPOs, especially in regeneration areas. Is this the wholesale reform that the Commission, for example, has been suggesting might be necessary?
No, not remotely. There is a fairly oblique comment in the policy paper that Matthew referred to that accompanied the LURB, saying that the government is looking at another CPO project with the Law Commission. We'll have to see what happens. I mean, the last time the Law Commission did a CPO project, again, it didn't lead to wholesale reform. So wait and see. But no, this is not drastically reforming CPO to make it much easier for LPAs.
Thank you very much, Stephen. A lot of the questions obviously focus on how all this fits with Finney and with the Snowdonia case, Hillside. What's your again? Is this going to make it easier for developers to pursue slightly amended schemes as and when economics dictate it?
I think up to a point, yes. I mean, I think to answer the questions directly, I think Finney is covered because it allows for, providing development stays substantially the same, it allows for changes in the description as well as the conditions. So I think in terms of meeting Finney, it does what it is intended to do. I think in terms of, however, when you move on, in terms of Hillside and what some of the points the Court of Appeal made in relation to that, then I think, quite frankly, we may well have to wait and see what the Supreme Court says. Because I puzzled when I looked at it, because it doesn't expressly deal with it, but the new power is broad, and it doesn't restrict as to when you can apply for the substantially the same permission, albeit you can't extend times. It doesn't say before development commences, for example. So to me, you could imply that it does allow for a drop in and meet some of the points. But I accept entirely, it was one of the questioner's points, surely it doesn't do it. Well, it doesn't expressly do it, no. But I think whether it's intended to is not clear, but I suspect it is intended to. But I think that we all have to wait to see quite what the Supreme Court say. And it's a pretty important decision and judgment on those wider points raised by the Court of Appeal as to the holistic approach to a planning commission, because that might require further legislation, quite frankly, or more express.
Or changes as this goes through, because maybe the judgment on Hillside will come through whilst it's going through Parliament. Exactly.
I think that hopefully that will work out, yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed to all our speakers. Thank you to everyone for listening. All of the talks will be on our website shortly, and you'll be sent them also by email. So thank you very much, and hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.